Good morning, everybody. I'm running a few minutes late tonight. Had to reboot the laptop that's running the software. So, hope everyone's doing great. Hope everyone's having a great week. I was at a local conference yesterday, and it kind of put me behind for the day. And I was setting up last night to do the stream, and I woke up and I realized it was about 1:30, 1:45, and I had slept all the way through in my chair, and so we didn't have a stream last night. So I'm doing it tonight. I wanted to make sure we did this. I did talk to several people over the conference that have watched the show. They're keeping up with the GLBA content, and I got some good feedback from them. And tonight I wanted to specifically talk about one of the line items that I got asked, I think it was 3 times last night, and it was about logs. And so that's tonight's topic. We're going to go over logs, what the guidance talks about, how we should look at logs, some things to keep to not do with your logs. And again, this is all about meeting the requirements of the new guidelines of Graham Leach Bliley, but it's also about making sure you're protecting your systems. You're doing the best implementation of security controls that you can in your organization. So let me switch over to the list of what you need. Of course, this is coming out of my presentation. Many of you have seen this. And this is the list of stuff that is specifically in the new guidelines for Graham Leach Bliley, but we've been kind of picking and choosing which ones we do first. And they actually have, the way I'm doing it, I have a very specific order, order of operations or implementation order that I think organizations, when they're doing this process, will need to go through. Doing your data flow diagram to understand where your stuff is at, then doing your risk assessment, and then today we're going to talk about doing your maintain and review logs of user activity. That's what that seems to catch a lot of people. It catches a lot of people in terms of they don't quite understand what it means. Or they make some assumptions. I guess that's a better way of saying it. They make some assumptions of what it means. And I think that gets us all into trouble when we start making assumptions on things. So with that said, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch it over to my laptop again so you guys can see. Now this is the FTC guidelines for Graham Leach Bliley. This is the one you do a search of what your business needs to know, GLBA, and this is what comes up off of their website. And specifically what we're talking about here is logs. Maintain a log of authorized users' activity and keep an eye out for unauthorized access. Implement procedures and controls to monitor when authorized users are accessing customer data information on your system and to detect unauthorized access. Okay. I think that this really does, it throws people for a loop. And I know the reason why, actually, or at least how that's happened in mine. So let's step back away from GLBA. Let's just talk about logs. There is a mindset that you have to capture everything. You capture everything, and you've got it in a database somewhere or in a storage area somewhere. And that's what you have to do. In fact, years ago, this is when I first became a CISO, and we were, I was youngish, in terms of doing this stuff, and there was a lot of pieces that I didn't know. And I knew that one of the big pieces, especially as it relates to what was being talked about in the industry, what was being talked about at conferences, and in training, was SIM. You got to collect all your logs, and of course you've got some pretty big names out there that was really marketing really hard, and it was a huge thing. So Me trying to be a good CISO or a good security professional, that was one of the things that I wanted to make sure I did was we would implement a SIM, and we did. I had someone who worked on it for 2 years. We collected logs. The first thing you had to do is collect all the logs from all of your services, your devices, your services, servers, your firewalls, network devices, authentication logs, access logs, everything. Put it somewhere to do some correlation, and then start figuring out what you've got. And it drove me absolutely nuts. Um, and I'll tell you why. We had a lot of logs, and somebody, I believe, and it's been a long time ago, but I believe that we were getting around 8 billion events in the log management system every week, or an equivalent of that. So much so that we went to, or the engineer at the time who was working for me had gone to a conference specifically about the tools we were using, and they had a very large organization that was there also using the same tools. And when I say large, it is a very large organization. Um, Compared to us, they're worldwide. They were only getting 3 billion events in their system a week, and the engineer came back and he was very proud that our system was collecting more data. And I just kind of sat there dumbfounded that we were collecting all this data and yet we weren't making any business decisions off of it. That, and when looking through the data, it didn't mean anything. It was just extra data. So that was my first lesson in SIM data and log aggregation, log correlation. And I've had a very specific mindset since then. That was early on. I have completely shifted my thinking. I believe the industry is shifting as well, and how they're looking at it. Here's what I do. I start with the questions. What are you trying to answer? With those questions, I look to see what logs we have to capture to answer those questions. And then I take that, and that goes into my log aggregation. Now, there are some logs you want in there all the time. Access logs, authentication logs, things like that. But from a general perspective, the logs that are put into your SIM or your managed system, or you want to make sure those logs are actually useful to you. And because I think a lot of organizations they've get this mindset that they just collect everything, and you're talking billions of events or 50 terabytes of log storage, and you can't parse through it, you can't make any decisions off of it, and so you have to go and buy even bigger tools, bigger hardware, clusters of servers, just to manage it and just to process it. And it becomes this vicious cycle. Now, I am not saying you shouldn't collect logs. I'm not even saying you shouldn't collect a lot of logs. If your organization supports that, if the security controls that you need in your organization requires that kind of log analysis, absolutely. But I would say a lot of organizations don't. So when I'm working with someone, and I'm talking with them about what they have and what they need in their organization, I go the other direction. I start minimal because it's easier to digest. It's easier to process. So in this particular case, let's do this. Let's go back to last week's. I've still got all my stuff up. So let's go back to last week's risk assessment stuff. So as you remember from the risk assessment, if you saw that episode, we had a private information server here. We have the cloud. We have some boxes. And we started talking about the risks, unpatched vulnerability, remote desktops, user access, API connections, and so on and so on. And then we went and we did a risk assessment, specifically risk mitigation, on, we have unpatched vulnerabilities, make sure the automatic updates are going on, make sure you have a verification of those updates, and we do regular vulnerability testing, require MFA, So, okay, here's what we did. We sat down, we did a risk assessment. So we came up with a whole bunch of vulnerabilities in our heads. We sat down with paint or around a table, and we came up with all the things that could go wrong, all the things that were a specific vulnerability in an organization and a possible threat that could take advantage of that, which otherwise is the definition of of a risk. So we did that, and then we started looking at mitigation controls. What do we need to do to protect that information or that system or that service? When you do that risk assessment, that's where your logging comes into play. So let's look at user access here. If someone gives up their creds, or users steal information and sell it, or they accidentally leave a computer on, or user computer gets stolen, those are the types of things you want to log. So let's pick give up their creds. That's the first one on there. How do you know someone has given up their creds? Well, you could do a couple of different things. You want to make sure you're capturing all the locations that a user account is logging into. And when you find one that is not a normal IP address from them, you question it. Why is it coming from that IP? Is it because they got a new computer somewhere else on a network somewhere, and so it pulled up a new IP address? Is it coming from a different country? Are they traveling? Are they using a VPN? MFA, or did they use MFA? Or was it simple authentication? Or did they use the MFA and they were able to get in? So these are the types of things that you should be pulling the logs off of. User steal information and sell. This could be that someone gets into a system and they start pulling data and then they turn around and sell it. So the logs would be that you see a particular user log into a service not during regular work hours, and they download a whole bunch of information that maybe is not the information they normally access. So that should be in a log somewhere, and that should be able, you can look at it and go, that's strange. Let's go take a look at that. And we have it, and we actually put in there, monitor the logs. That's what you do, is you monitor everyone, people accessing that data. So that's those are the types of things you need to think about. So you do a risk assessment, you determine what your mitigation controls are to reduce that risk, or to eliminate the risk, or reduce the risk. And part of that is understanding what's happening and what you need to monitor and what you need to evaluate. So when we look back at this Graham-Leach-Bliley, specifically it says maintain a log of authorized users' activity and keep an eye out for unauthorized access. When we talk about an organization's logging activity, a lot of people will think about, okay, well, we need to export all of our data from Active Directory, so all authentications for Active Directory, and they dump that to a database, and they do some sort of searching or indexing on it, then they do some searching. And they use a variety of tools. And I try to be tool agnostic on this. On this streamcast, it doesn't matter the tools you use as long as it works for you. But as a general rule, that's the process. You take all your logs, you put it into a system that gets indexed, and then you do queries against it. So when we are maintaining a log of authorized users' activity, so let's keep this very, very simple. Number one, we're going to, what is the systems? We kind of go back to that data flow diagram. Do I have it? Maybe I actually do have the data flow diagram still in this. Happy data flow. I actually caught a lot of flack about my happy little boxes. This still bothers me, actually, that people didn't like my happy little boxes. Okay, so this is the data flow diagram, and we're going to look at this. I know it's kind of messy, it's kind of cluttered, But let's take a look at this from a logging perspective. What are some things that you probably want to log in this data flow diagram? Number one, anywhere you see arrows, you probably want to make sure that you have some sort of logging. Make sure that it's actually coming in and going out correctly. As it goes to something like HR or accounting or IT, you want logs of who downloaded that, on where that download is going and who is doing it. So let's take HR for example, because that's just the first one there. Someone in HR downloads the server data, and they do it for their job. You should have a log of that. You know that Jane Smith downloaded this data, and she downloads it at 3 o'clock every day. If you see a download at 7 o'clock at night, that should give you an alert. Even if it's just when you look at it the next day, let's take away all the alerting. Let's take away all the automatic detection and response of everything. Let's just look at it from a person is looking at the logs perspective. If you see this is downloading every day at 3 o'clock, then all of a sudden you see that this same download happens at 7 o'clock. Why? Why did that happen? Now, it could be a completely legitimate reason. Oh, well, they took vacation that day and they had to do it at the end of the day. They had to catch up, so they did the download then. Maybe they forgot that day. Maybe they did the download and it was corrupted. They uploaded it to, wherever, and somebody called them up and says, hey, the data is corrupted. Can you download it again? They download it again. So it could be a very legitimate reason why it was done outside of normal hours. But it should be something that triggers like, oh, that's different. That's strange. Another example, let's say Jane in HR. She when she downloads the file, it's usually 1 meg. Maybe 1 meg, 1.1 meg, 1.2 meg. And on Friday, she downloaded a file that was over 100 meg. That's different. That's something that you should go, that's strange. I wonder why. So you call up Jane and go, hey, I saw that this log file was significantly larger than it has been in the past. Why is that? And then we say, oh, we're doing end of the year stuff. Great. You're done. You've explained why, you've reviewed it, you've explained why it's happened, and you can move on. Now, to tell you the truth, this is not necessarily an IT or an IT security review. This is going to be someone in HR reviewing these logs. I mean, it could be someone in IT, and in some cases you do. Maybe it's a conditional access issue of you see someone logging in from an international country and downloading this. That's going to flag something in a SOC or flag someone's just monitoring the data or monitoring the logs and go, hey, that's strange. Let's go figure it out. But in terms of Jane Smith downloading it, there has to be accountability of, was she doing it properly? So here's an example that a friend of mine uses when they're talking about this. This is specifically for HIPAA, and the story that he tells is there was a doctor who was, let's say he was a great doctor. I'm going to embellish some of the pieces because I don't know the whole story, but he was a doctor. He was moving from one hospital to another. It was his last day. And he goes in and he looks at a whole bunch of patient records in the system, in the electronic medical record system, EMR system. And he goes and looks at a whole bunch of records, and then he leaves. He goes on to this other hospital, and somebody, when reviewing the data, sees that he was accessing records that were not his patients. He was actually accessing like famous people or people of special note in the system. Well, they turned that in because he didn't have any business need to look at those records, so they turned him in, and I believe he lost his license. That was because it's a violation of the guidelines set forth by HIPAA and or other ones. And again, I don't know all the pieces to this, but that piece of the story really stuck with me. That he was a doctor. He was accessing records he should not have been, and they caught him. They submitted a complaint. The person lost his license, and so on and so on. But if someone had not been looking at monitoring those record accesses, they would not have ever known that. And that's what we're talking about here is if Jane is downloading a bunch of records from the server and something is different, or maybe it's not Jane, maybe it's John. Maybe John downloads it that day. Someone in HR should look at that and go, okay, that's not normal, but we also know Jane was on vacation that day, so John took over. Perfectly explainable. You document it, you move on. So I hope that makes a little sense in terms of what kinds of things that they're looking for in the logging. Now, when you're looking at this diagram and you start looking at all the arrows, and you definitely want to log all those arrows, that's what you're going to review. There may be some more specific information, such as did Jane or John download and open a file on their personal device? So that could be, again, it's an arrow, but it's did it in the logging of that download, did it download to a machine name that we know about? Maybe you have a particular naming scheme for all of your desktops in your organization, and you should be able to see that it was downloaded by this machine name by John, and you go, wait a second, that's not their office machine. That looks to be a personal laptop. So at that point, John has downloaded critical data to a personal machine, and you have that in the log. So you should do whatever your policy states in terms of maybe a progressive discipline or retraining or termination or whatever it takes, in that situation. But that's the stuff you need to monitor. And the way to think about it is if you have an arrow on your data flow diagram, that's probably where you need to start in terms of your logging, because that's an easy log to capture. Was something downloaded? Was something accessed? Now, there's a lot of other kinds of accesses, such as, let's talk about the ERP specifically. We're talking about downloading it, and you're downloading to a laptop or a desktop or something like that, and you should keep those logs like that. But in most ERPs, you have something on there that shows someone logged in. And hopefully it shows what record that they had access to when they logged in. Now, some of these logins could be done because you've got a multi-factor front end on it. So you can monitor Jane and John both logged into this system at 8 o'clock and 8:03 in the morning, and then they disconnected from it at noon, and they logged in again at 1, and they disconnected at 5:05. That would be probably a normal login schedule. Now, if you see that specifically John's account, logs into the ERP at midnight, I'm hoping that will flag. Okay, so again, let's not talk about alerting right now. Let's just talk about if you're reviewing the log and you saw that should be something that stands out. Why was John accessing the ERP at midnight? Was he just doing work from home? Was he downloading stuff he shouldn't have been? There's all these different things. So it could be that, you start your investigation, your pseudo investigation. You go, okay, I see John logged in to the ERP at midnight. He then initiated a query that downloads a report of all payroll schedules. But he's not in payroll. He's in, I don't know. Well, he works in HR. Let's say he's in employment or something. I don't know. Pick a department in HR, but he's not payroll. So now it should come to mind to someone in HR, the supervisor should go, why was this person logging in at midnight, running a query about payroll, and downloading it? Now, it may be a completely legitimate reason they do it, but that's the questions you need to ask. If he did it and he didn't have authorization to do it, that's exactly what this is for. Maintain a log of authorized users' activity and keep an eye out for an unauthorized access. So I would say that that is definitely if John logged in outside of his regular hours into the system and ran a query that he doesn't normally run, he didn't have authorization to run it, and he had access to data that he should not have had access to because he should not have run it, then that becomes a problem. And that's a problem with the data security and the privacy. Does that make sense for people? I hope that makes sense. I know I'm just kind of bouncing around the pictures here, but it seems to me when I talk to people about this, they really make it, they get lost in the details. Because they're going to start pulling, let's get all the logs off this server, all the logs off the desktops, all the logs off the websites, all the logs off the AWS. And that might be very beneficial to you in some way, but I don't think it helps most people, because what you truly need to look at is even if you just did your logs, excuse me, from your data lifecycle. How does the data come in? How does it get stored? How does it get used and by whom? And how does it get destroyed? The data lifecycle there on the right. That becomes, if you log each one of those pieces, I think that's a really good analysis, and I think that would absolutely meet the intent of this: maintain a log of authorized users' activity and keep an eye out for an unauthorized access. It's not complicated. It's just, okay, is the person who's accessing this log approved to have that? Now, I will tell you, when we're talking about the data lifecycle and specifically how does data get used and by whom, you should have a list, honestly. First of all, you should be using least privilege, and I think that's a big thing for organizations because they don't use least privilege. But if John did not have access to particular records, if he tried to access it, it would just deny him. But a lot of organizations will say, okay, well, everybody in HR has access to everything for a variety of reasons. Well, that becomes a real problem because you're not managing least privilege at that point. You're actually doing maximum privilege. And if you have to do that for whatever reason, that's when your logging is even more critical. Because if everybody has access, you have to monitor the access that they have. You have to monitor these arrows. Who is downloading the data? Who is accessing the data? And then otherwise, what are they doing with the data? Let's jump back here. What does it actually say? Unauthorized access. Implement procedures and controls to monitor when authorized users are accessing customer data on your system and detect unauthorized. So it's not, even just from these guidelines, you can't just look for unauthorized access. Because if you have a user that accesses data when they're not authorized to for a business need, that in itself is unauthorized access. And what does, when we're thinking about this, what does that mean? Well, let's go back to the doctor. The doctor, he had access to all patient records. But if he didn't need to look at that particular patient's record, that was a violation. So in the case of our HR example here, if they are accessing payroll data and they're not in payroll, or they're not running a payroll report because they were asked to do it, then that becomes unauthorized access. And that's going to be what should show up in your logs. Okay. So I think we've beat that topic several different ways. Now, what does it mean? What is it? Okay, we've talked about why you need to do it and kind of what you need to look for, but let's talk about the functional side. What are we talking about here? When we are talking about unauthorized access, or when we're talking about monitoring the access logs, there are some tools that make it really easy. You know, if you're using something like Office 365 and you have OneDrive, there are screens that you can get to say who all opened this record, or who all opened this file. I mean, that's very, very simple. If you are using like an EMR or some other document retention, a document management system, excuse me, it's late, and it is a sleepless and cyber night. Last night was not sleepless and cyber because I actually got some sleep. It was in my chair, but still got some sleep. Anyway, you know, if you're using a document management system, generally that's built in. Yeah, who has access what files. So you really just have to go and monitor that. Somebody needs to go in, let's say on a daily basis, and see who all access things. Maybe it's a weekly basis. I would encourage people to do daily, just because at weekly or monthly, you're getting to be a lot of records, and people don't remember. It's like, oh, well, such and such, were they here that day or were they not? So do daily reviews on this. Oh, excuse me. Sorry about that. But when we're talking about alerting, once you kind of know what is normal activity, a lot of these systems will actually let you do an alert if something is out of the ordinary. So when you have a file get accessed outside of regular hours, you could have it send you an alert, you know, an email or a text message or whatever. Or you can actually put sensitivity labels and data limitations on there and just not let it be accessed. I knew a system once, or I knew an organization that had a system. They turned their ERP off at, I think, 6. They just turned it off. And they wouldn't turn it back on until 8 in the morning. And I asked them one day, it's like, well, why do you do that? And they said, well, it's simple. They don't need to be accessing it. We don't want them to access it. And if it's down, we don't have to worry about people hacking it. Okay. I can't disagree with that generally. You know, that philosophy is somewhat sound. If it's literally turned off, yeah, it's a little bit harder to get into. So they made sure that people just couldn't access it. No, I'm not recommending that per se. You know, that might be a little bit it might be hard to function like that because you have to do Windows updates and monitoring and logging and whatever. But you know, that does help when you're doing an analysis of activity. Oh, excuse me. Oh, it is getting late. I'm going to have to cut this short. Okay. So monitoring your systems, your document management systems, your Office 365, your OneDrive, and here's the thing: if you are still using old file shares, which are very, very popular still, you're not getting a lot of that information. You could pull some of it out in the logs of the system. Such and such access this file, but you really need to have a correlation process, something to index it and to look at it. So that gives you a reason to migrate over to a more modern system that has that logging built in, gives you that ability to pull that data out, and then you have somebody actually go monitor it. So, all right, let's. I know I've kind of babbled a little bit here because it's late and I'm tired, but I do want to cover this, you know, kind of start to finish real quick. So, your risk assessment that you have completed. So first, your data flow diagram. You need to know where your data is at and what the data is moving, how it moves back and forth. Anywhere that there's a change or a transfer, you know, your data is coming in or data moving to a person, you need to log that. If someone is accessing it, you need to log that. You need to review that. You need to have somebody on a regular basis actually look through all of the accesses to that document or to that data, or all of the downloads to that data, or, you know, all the downloads of that data. This person is generally someone in the department who knows who should be accessing it. In some cases, it is IT or IT security because they're going to be monitoring it from a larger perspective. Let's say they're downloading it from China, and we don't have anybody in China. That's probably not an authorized download. So that's something to keep in mind. Your tools that you're using, I've worked with a lot of people who they spent a lot of time and effort trying to pull logs out of an old system when they could have spent all that time to just upgrade to a new system that gives them that logging. So, I mean, it's a balance. If you have an old traditional file share and you're trying to pull your access logs out of it, you can probably do it. I honestly would recommend you just upgrade to a modern system that has all that. OneDrive is fabulous for that. I really like the logging that I can get. I had an incident, I don't know, a fair time ago where we had to verify if someone accessed a file. And I very quickly was able to go in and look at every single person that had accessed the file to verify that someone did not access it. Is there a possibility that they still saw the data? Well, sure, there is. They could have gotten it, someone could have screenshotted it or whatever, got it. But the actual just default access of that log through the tool showed that that user account did not access this file. That was great. That made my life a heck of a lot easier because it's right there in the logs. I knew what had happened at that point. So modern tools give you modern logs. You do have to have someone look through them. I mean, you do have to go through, and you have to document that process. So when you're writing your policy, again, keep this simple. We're gonna have a whole episode on just policies and procedures, but let's keep your access log policy simple. We go back and look at what it says here. It says maintain a log of authorized users' activity. Well, that right there is something that you need to have in your policy, that you're going to maintain the log of authorized users' activity. So let's say you move all your files to OneDrive and you're using that as your file storage. You are going to maintain the log. So you need to make sure that the logging is turned on and that you keep it for an X amount of time, depending on how your system is set up. So that's in your policy. All files go here because that's where we have logging. No files go anywhere else that is not covered under logging. Okay, that's the first thing to have in your policy. Second thing is keep an eye out for unauthorized access. Well, that means someone's got to look at it. So in your policy, you're going to put in there that such and such position or person has a responsibility to monitor these logs on a daily basis to look for unauthorized activity. Unauthorized access. I would probably put activity, but it depends on how you want to write it. That is your policy. There you go. Maintain a log. So you're going to put it on a system that maintains it's going to have those logs for you. And you're going to have on the policy who is going to look for unauthorized access. Then implement procedures and controls to monitor when authorized users are accessing. So you need to show them, okay, you're going to go to this website and you're going to look at all these logs on a daily basis. You put that in your procedures, in your documentation of this is what you need to do. And you're going to have them evaluate all of these logins. And maybe you even give them a quick guide of things to look for. If this is outside of business hours, if this is outside of the country, if this is an IP that is not recognized, that's what they're going to look for. That, I believe, would meet all the requirements of this number 8 of maintaining review logs of user activity. Because you're maintaining it, you have it one location, you have someone who is monitoring it and looking for things that are out of the ordinary. Now, once you get this kind of in a process, you can absolutely set alerting up on it. Or you could set it up on part of your SIM, or you can set it up as part of your managed SOC services, where they look for any activity that's outside regular business hours, outside of the country, or if someone is accessing a data sensitivity label that they don't normally access, all that could be alerts, and those alerts can go into email or a phone call to an appropriate individual so that they can go in and evaluate whether or not there was unauthorized access. Okay, so there's one other piece that we need to really talk about on this, because it says it in here, but I think people kind of misunderstand what it means. Unauthorized access. There are interpretations that if a person gets access, not that they accessed it, just the mere fact that they got access is a violation. Now, I've said it many times. I don't, as a CISO, I don't want to interpret anything. I want it to be very clear cut, and that's how I enforce it. Interpretation falls under the judge's responsibility, and in the world that I live in, I want the judge to interpret things. I don't want to be the one that's questioned on how I interpreted it. But unauthorized access, in some cases, people have let that be the mere fact that they got access to it. They had. So here's an example. If someone had root access, a username and password that had root access to a box, even though they didn't use it, they didn't actually log into the box, but they had access to it, that could be problematic. So be very, very careful the words you use and what they mean, and you need to be very careful. So in the case of access to a server, it's not just so much that this person, that your HR person, would otherwise be looking at someone who has downloaded the data or opened a data record. They should also be monitoring who has access to that server. It could be as simple as they need to go, who can remote desktop into the server, who can log into it, locally. If it's let's say a physical box or a VM and they have vSphere client. If the HR manager sees an IT staff member log into this box, they should question it. Why did you log into this box? Why did you log into this box and download a copy to an Excel spreadsheet of this data in this SQL database? That in itself should raise red flags for that HR person, because in some cases that IT person, maybe they are, just doing updates or something, but if they download data, were they really doing a business function? So don't forget that it's not just about accessing data, but also access to data. So it's not just authorized users or unauthorized users in the traditional sense, but if someone has root access or administrator access, that could also be problematic. And that is something that they have to monitor. They have to monitor that and review it on a regular basis to determine, why did this person access this server? I can tell you, generally speaking, if you are a root level or enter an administrator level account on a server, you can, in some cases, delete logs or modify things that could hide your presence there. Malicious actors do it all the time. That's one of the things they do. If they can get in, they delete the logs of their trail, that's covering their tracks. So if a system administrator has logged into the computer, we want to know why, because if they have administrator rights, they could do a lot of things. So anyway, it is 12:46. It's midnight 46, and I think I've hit all the topics I wanted to do, and I am getting pretty tired, and I still have some business-related items I need to take care of before I go get some rest. I hope this was useful for everybody. I hope I didn't ramble too much. I did not necessarily have this one scripted. None of these are scripted. I didn't have this really planned out. I just wanted to talk about it based off the information, the feedback that I got from people yesterday at the conference. So for those of you who are watching this series and are finding some value in it, I do appreciate the feedback. I'm doing this to help people make their system safer, to certainly meet compliance, but also just to help people understand this maybe a little bit differently. It seems overwhelming at times, and it shouldn't be. And so we're breaking that's on the list here one by one, and we're talking about it to kind of get you in the mindset of how to approach it in your organization. With that said, I'm going to go ahead and break for the evening. I hope everyone has a great rest of the week. It's Thursday. It's Friday now since it's past over midnight. So last day of the week. I hope everyone has a great weekend. It's getting cooler down here. I think the temperatures are back up to 85, but we hit 27 degrees. I think it was 27 when I left for the conference yesterday morning. So it's getting to be fall. We're really enjoying it. Or I'm enjoying the cooler weather. So I hope you are too. So have a great night, and we'll see you guys next week. Bye.